The afternoon sun was gentle over a small-town park, where a local charity event had gathered families, veterans, and a few familiar faces from the film world. Among them stood Clint Eastwood, calm, humble, and approachable as ever, greeting fans with that half-smile the world had known for decades. People crowded around him for photos and autographs, their voices blending into cheerful background noise. Kids ran around with balloons, laughter filling the air. It was supposed to be an ordinary day, until something extraordinary happened. From the edge of the crowd, a little girl about 8 years old stepped forward. She clutched a worn-out notebook to her chest and looked both nervous and brave at the same time. Her mother urged her forward gently. Clint noticed her and gave a small nod, smiling kindly. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said in his deep, steady voice. "What's your name?" She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lila," she said. "Nice to meet you, Lila. You want a picture or an autograph?" But instead of answering, she looked up with big, honest eyes and asked, "Mr. Eastwood, do you believe in God?" The question cut through the noise like a blade of light. The chatter stopped. The laughter faded. Even the phones lowered. For a moment, Clint just stared at her, not in confusion, but in reflection. People waited, unsure how he would respond. It wasn't the kind of question you expect at a public event. The girl held her notebook tighter, her tiny hands trembling slightly. Clint knelt down so their eyes were level. The crowd leaned in. He spoke softly, almost like he was talking to his own granddaughter. "That's a big question, Lila," he said, his voice warm but serious. "Why do you ask?" The little girl bit her lip and answered quietly, "Because my dad says God doesn't listen anymore." Clint's expression changed, not with surprise, but with something deeper. His eyes softened. He didn't answer right away. For a few seconds, time seemed to freeze. The air around them was still, as if even the wind had paused to listen. Clint Eastwood stayed kneeling in front of the little girl, eyes gentle yet filled with years of experience. A man who had seen the world at its best and its worst. The little girl's question hung between them. "Do you believe in God?" And her words echoed softly in his mind, along with that second line. "My dad says God doesn't listen anymore." Clint looked down briefly, his rugged face thoughtful. Then he slowly raised his eyes and gave her a small, reassuring smile. He spoke softly, so the crowd had to lean in to hear. "Your dad. He sounds like a man who's been hurt," Clint said. "And when people get hurt, sometimes they stop talking to God, or they think he stopped talking back." The girl's eyes glistened. She nodded faintly. "He says praying doesn't change anything." Clint paused again, his gaze drifting across the park, to the families laughing, the trees swaying gently, the golden sunlight slipping through the leaves. He could feel the weight of her words, but also the innocence behind them. This wasn't just a child's curiosity. It was a heart looking for hope. He leaned a little closer and asked, "Lila, can I tell you something?" She nodded, clutching her notebook tightly. "When I was younger," Clint began, his voice low and reflective, "I didn't understand God either. I thought life was just about surviving, working hard, fighting your battles, and hoping you'd make it through. There were times I didn't pray. I didn't even know what to say if I did." The crowd stayed silent. "You could hear a pin drop, but as I got older," he continued, "I realized something. God doesn't always answer with words. Sometimes he answers through people, through moments, even through pain." The girl's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to ask more, but couldn't find the courage. Clint smiled softly and pointed at her. "Like right now," he said. "You came here, and you asked me a question that most adults are too afraid to ask. That's not just you talking, Lila. That's something bigger. Maybe that's God using you to remind all of us he's still listening." A quiet murmur spread through the crowd. Some smiled, others blinked away tears. The girl tilted her head. "But how can we know he's listening if we can't hear him?" Clint nodded slowly, as if he had asked himself that same question 1,000 times. "That's the hard part," he said gently. "We keep looking for a loud voice in the sky, or a miracle that changes everything overnight. But maybe God speaks differently. Maybe he whispers, through the sound of the wind, through a person who cares, through a moment that makes you stop and think. He paused, then added with quiet conviction, sometimes silence is not God ignoring us. It's him waiting for us to listen. The little girl's eyes filled with tears. She wasn't sad. She was moved, as if something inside her finally made sense. Clint smiled again, a little lighter this time. You know what I think, Lila? I think your question today might just be his way of saying he's proud of you for asking. The crowd was completely still. A few people began to clap softly, not out of habit, but out of pure respect. Clint slowly stood back up, towering but gentle, looking down at her with genuine affection. He placed a hand over his heart. Don't ever stop asking, kid, he said quietly. The world needs more people brave enough to wonder. The girl wiped her eyes with her sleeve and whispered, Thank you, Mr. Eastwood. He smiled, then lightly tapped her notebook. You keep that close. Write down your questions, your dreams, even the things that scare you. God reads those too. Her mother stood nearby, emotional, whispering a quiet, thank you, as she held her daughter close. The moment felt like it belonged in a film. But this wasn't acting. It was real. A Hollywood legend and a little girl had just shared something pure, a bridge between doubt and faith. As Clint turned to wave at the crowd, people started cheering softly, not the kind of cheer that follows a celebrity, but the kind that follows a man who just reminded everyone what humanity looks like. And in that moment, as the little girl walked away with her mother, clutching her notebook, she turned back one last time and smiled. Clint nodded at her, tipping his hat slightly, that familiar Eastwood gesture, and whispered under his breath, Yeah. He's listening. Engagement line. Have you ever heard a child ask something that completely stopped you in your tracks? Share that moment and tell me which country or city you're watching from. The park had fallen quiet again. The laughter that once echoed through the air now faded into gentle murmurs of awe. People weren't looking at a movie star anymore. They were looking at a man, real and raw, speaking from the kind of truth that doesn't come from scripts or cameras. Clint took a slow breath, eyes drifting toward the horizon as if remembering something far away. He looked back at the little girl, who still stood there holding her notebook, eyes wide with trust. You know, Lila, he began, his voice deep and steady. When I was about your age, I asked that same question. The crowd leaned closer. Even the kids who had been playing nearby stopped to listen. Clint continued, I didn't grow up with much. My family moved a lot. New towns, new schools, new faces. Sometimes I felt invisible. I remember one winter I prayed for something simple, a warm coat. I didn't get one. I thought maybe God forgot about me. He gave a small, nostalgic smile. But a few days later, a neighbor, an old man who barely even knew my name, showed up at our door with a box of clothes. Inside was this thick brown jacket that fit me perfectly. I wore that thing until it fell apart. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. Back then, I didn't realize it. But now I know. Maybe God didn't forget. Maybe he just used someone else to remind me he was still there. Lila listened closely, hanging on every word. Her mother had her hand over her mouth, visibly moved. Clint's gaze softened again. When I got older, I went through darker times. Times when I lost people I loved. Times when I thought, if there's really a God up there, why would he let this happen? He paused. The silence carried weight. I was angry. I stopped talking to him. I stopped believing there was any plan or purpose. But looking back now, I realize he never left. I just stopped listening. The words hit the crowd like quiet thunder. It wasn't preaching. It was confession. He went on, You see, Lila, life has a funny way of teaching you. Sometimes the hardest roads, the ones that make you question everything, are the ones that bring you closer to understanding. The little girl blinked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. So even when bad things happen, God's still there? Clint nodded slowly, always. Maybe not in the way we expect, but he's there. Sometimes he lets the storm come, not to drown you, but to show you how strong you really are. The girl's lips trembled into a soft smile. Clint looked around the park. Everyone was completely silent. Parents were holding their kids a little closer. Some people had tears in their eyes, he continued, his tone softer now, almost like a whisper. When I started making movies, people asked me what I believed in. And you know what I told them? I said I believe in quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself. That's what faith is. It's not shouting from the rooftops. It's standing still when life gets loud. He placed a hand gently on his chest. I've faced moments in my life that could have broken me. But something always told me to keep going. Maybe that was God's voice. Maybe it was the faith he planted in me a long time ago. Lila's eyes shimmered, her tiny voice trembling. I think, maybe he sent you today. Clint smiled warmly. Maybe he sent you to remind me why I still believe. The crowd exhaled softly, many smiling through tears. The connection between the two felt deeper than words, a reminder that faith isn't about religion, but about heart. Clint straightened up, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the ground. He looked at the people watching, hundreds now, and said something that silenced every whisper. God doesn't live in churches or buildings. He lives in moments like this, in honesty, kindness, and questions like hers. The little girl reached into her notebook, tore out a small page and handed it to him. It's my favorite verse, she said shyly. Clint unfolded it. In a child's handwriting it read, "Be still, and know that I am God." He looked at her with glistening eyes. That's a good one, he said quietly. Maybe that's the secret, just being still long enough to listen. The audience started clapping, slowly, respectfully, emotionally. No one shouted, no one cheered wildly. It was the kind of applause that said, "Thank you." Clint placed the little note in his jacket pocket and smiled. I think I'll keep this, he said. And as the girl smiled back through her tears, Clint added with a nod, You asked a brave question today, Lila. Don't ever stop asking. Because that's how you'll always find your way back to him. Engagement line. Do you believe that people or moments come into our lives for a reason? Comment yes if you've ever felt that, and share your story below. The applause faded into a soft hush again. Clint Eastwood stood still for a moment, the piece of paper from the little girl tucked gently in his hand. He looked at it once more. Be still and know that I am God, and smiled quietly, as if the words themselves carried something sacred. He turned back toward Lila. The little girl was still standing there, eyes glistening, but calm now, as though his stories had lifted a heavy weight off her small shoulders. Clint crouched down again so their eyes met, the warm afternoon light falling gently across both their faces. Lila, he said softly, I think people make faith a lot more complicated than it really is. The girl blinked, curious. What do you mean? He smiled faintly. They think believing in God means never being scared, never doubting, never falling down. But that's not true. Faith doesn't mean you stop questioning. It means you keep believing, even while you're asking the hard questions. The crowd listened silently, drawn in by the raw sincerity in his voice. Clint continued, When I was younger, I thought faith was about waiting for miracles, big, impossible things. But the older I got, the more I realized something. God doesn't always shout from the sky. He whispers. He looked up at the branches overhead, the leaves rustling softly in the breeze. You hear him in the wind, in a stranger's kindness, in moments that make your heart slow down and your mind quiet. That's his way of saying I'm still here. Lila tilted her head, her small voice trembling with honesty. So, if God whispers, how do we know what he's saying? Clint nodded slowly, as if the question carried wisdom beyond her years. That's the thing, he said. You don't always know right away, but you'll feel it. When you do something good for someone without expecting anything back, that's him speaking through you. When you forgive instead of hate, when you hope instead of quit, that's his voice too. He paused, smiling gently. Sometimes faith is just about listening closely enough to notice. A mother in the crowd wiped away a tear. Someone whispered, That's beautiful. Clint looked around, his weathered face glowing with the kind of light only experience gives. You see, Lila, he said softly, Faith isn't about never falling. It's about knowing that when you do fall, you're not falling alone. God's right there, waiting for you to stand up again. The girl took a small breath and nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I think I understand. Clint smiled warmly. You do. Better than most grown-ups, actually. The crowd chuckled softly. He continued. You asked me earlier if I believe in God. The truth is, I don't just believe in Him. I believe with Him. I believe with the strength He gives me to get through another day. With the courage He gives me to do the right thing when no one's watching. That's faith. It's not about religion or titles. It's about the choices we make when life gets quiet. Lila's eyes filled again, but this time it wasn't confusion or sadness. It was awe, Mr. Eastwood, she said quietly. Do you ever talk to Him? Clint chuckled softly. Every day. Sometimes out loud, sometimes just in my head. And sometimes, he added with a grin, I don't say a word. I just sit still, because I figure He already knows what's in here. He tapped his chest gently over his heart. The girl nodded slowly, clutching her notebook again. My dad says prayers don't work anymore. Clint looked at her kindly, his expression both gentle and firm. Well, Lila, he said, maybe your dad's prayers stopped working because he stopped believing they could. Prayer isn't magic, it's a conversation. And conversations only work if both sides are still listening. The girl's lips curved into the faintest smile. Maybe I'll tell him that. You should, Clint said. And tell him this. Even if he doesn't feel like God's listening, you are. And maybe that's how God reaches him. Through you. For a moment the girl just stared at him, her small chest rising and falling as tears finally slipped down her cheeks. But she was smiling now. Clint leaned forward slightly, his tone soft but steady. Don't ever let the world make you stop believing in goodness, okay? Because when you do, that's when you stop hearing Him. The girl nodded and wiped her tears, whispering, I won't. Clint stood up slowly, slipping the little note into his jacket pocket. He looked down at her one last time and said, You have more faith than most people ever find in a lifetime. Don't lose it. Then, turning to the crowd, he added, Maybe that's the lesson we all forget. God's not gone. We just stopped listening. The park was completely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. And in that stillness, everyone there felt something shift inside, a small reminder that maybe, just maybe, faith wasn't about being perfect. It was about staying open. Clint smiled faintly, almost to himself, and said under his breath, Sometimes the smallest questions bring the biggest answers. The crowd erupted in gentle applause, emotional, grateful, and deeply moved. Parents hugged their children. Strangers exchanged glances that said thank you. And somewhere in the middle of that park, a little girl held her notebook tighter. And for the first time in a long time, she felt God was listening again. For a long moment, no one said a word. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves and the soft, uneven breathing of those trying not to cry. The park, once noisy and full of chatter, now felt like sacred ground. Clint Eastwood stood quietly, his tall frame calm against the golden light. The little girl, Lila, looked up at him through teary eyes, her notebook pressed tightly against her heart. She took a small, hesitant step forward and said softly, So, God still listens? Clint smiled, that small, knowing smile that carried decades of wisdom and kindness. He nodded. He's listening right now, he said gently. He never stopped. Lila's lower lip trembled. Even when people stop believing? Even then, Clint said, because that's the thing about love, Lila. It doesn't give up, even when we do. And God's love, it's bigger than any silence. A tear rolled down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away, embarrassed. But Clint shook his head with a smile. Don't hide those tears, he said softly. Sometimes tears are just the soul's way of saying thank you. The crowd behind them was completely silent. Some people were openly crying now, while others stood frozen, caught between awe and emotion. Clint took a deep breath, his voice soft but steady. When you asked me that question earlier, I didn't expect it to hit me so hard, he admitted. But you reminded me of something I forgot. That the simplest questions often carry the biggest truths. He crouched down again to her level, his old, gentle eyes locking with hers. "Do you know what faith really is?" he asked. Lila sniffled and shook her head. Clint smiled faintly. "It's choosing to believe even when you don't have proof. It's trusting that the light is still there, even when you can't see it yet." He paused and placed a hand over his heart. "When you get older, life will test that. There'll be days when everything feels dark, when people disappoint you, when you'll wonder if God still cares. And in those moments, remember this: He's closer than you think." The girl stared at him silently, a tear hanging on her lashes. "How do you know?" she whispered. Clint smiled gently. "Because I've been there. I've doubted, I've fallen, I've lost. But every time I thought I was alone, something or someone showed up to prove I wasn't." He gestured toward her. "Just like you did today." The words hit her heart like a wave. Her tears spilled freely now, but she didn't hide them this time. Clint reached out, wiping one tear from her cheek with a fatherly tenderness that made the entire crowd exhale softly. "You don't ever have to be afraid of asking about God," he said quietly. "He's big enough for all your questions, and patient enough to wait for your heart to understand." Lila nodded, her small voice trembling. I think I want to talk to him again," Clint chuckled warmly. "That's the best decision you'll ever make." The little girl's mother was crying now too, holding her hands over her mouth. It was clear this moment meant more than words could capture. Clint continued, "You know, Lila, the world teaches us to be strong, to never cry, never doubt, never ask for help. But real strength isn't about pretending to have it all figured out. Real strength is faith, believing when it doesn't make sense." He looked around at the crowd, his voice steady but emotional. "Maybe that's what this world needs again. A little more faith, a little more kindness, and a little more courage to believe that something good is still out there." The audience erupted in soft applause again, many wiping tears from their faces. The energy was different this time. Not excitement, not admiration, but gratitude. Clint stood and gently extended his hand. Lila took it, her tiny fingers wrapped around his weathered hand, fragile and trusting. He smiled down at her. "Promise me one thing," he said. "What?" she whispered. "That you'll never stop believing that love still wins," he said softly. "Because when you believe that, you'll always find God." She nodded slowly, her tear-streaked face breaking into a trembling smile. "I promise," Clint smiled back, eyes misty now. "That's my girl." For a few seconds, they just stood there on the old Hollywood legend and the small child holding hands as if the whole world had paused to watch a silent conversation between faith and innocence. Then Clint gently released her hand and said, "Now go give your dad a hug. Tell him God never stopped listening." The crowd broke into quiet applause again, some capturing the moment on their phones. Others, too, moved to even move. As Lila walked back toward her mother, she turned one last time. Clint gave her that soft, iconic smile, the kind that carried warmth, peace, and something sacred. The mother whispered something to her, and the little girl nodded. Then she looked up at the sky as if silently saying thank you. Clint stood still, watching her leave. A small breeze passed through the park, rustling the trees gently, as if nature itself had bowed in quiet agreement. He smiled faintly and whispered, almost to himself, "Yeah, he's listening." Everyone could feel it. This wasn't going to be just a reply. It was going to be a moment. When Lila walked back into her mother's arms, something in the air shifted. The moment didn't just end. It lingered, like an echo that refused to fade. The park, which had once been filled with idle chatter, now felt sacred. People weren't just watching a celebrity anymore. They were witnessing something profoundly human. Clint Eastwood stood quietly in the middle of it all, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, the note with the verse still close to his heart. His weathered eyes scanned the small crowd, people of all ages, different walks of life. Yet in that instant, everyone looked the same, softened, humbled, moved. A young man in his 20s broke the silence first. He had been filming the entire exchange. With teary eyes, he whispered, "I wasn't even religious before this. but something about what he said. He paused, voice trembling. It just felt real. Beside him, an elderly woman clutched her rosary, murmuring softly. "Maybe God sent that little girl today," Clint smiled faintly, overhearing just enough to know the moment had landed where it needed to. He didn't want attention, but he also knew sometimes truth needs witnesses. Suddenly, a teenager called out, phone in hand. "Sir, can I share this online?" Clint looked up, amused. "If it helps someone believe again," he said, "then yeah." "Go ahead." Within minutes, that video began its quiet journey, uploaded, reposted, shared, and reshared. What started as a small, intimate conversation between a legend and a little girl would soon cross oceans. But for now, it was still just a tender memory hanging in the warm afternoon air. Lila and her mother came forward once more. The mother's eyes were red from crying. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't just talk to her. You reminded me too." Clint smiled kindly. "She reminded me as well," he replied. The woman looked surprised. "You?" Clint chuckled softly. "Oh, I've spent a lot of years chasing meaning, same as everyone else. But sometimes it takes a child to remind you what really matters." The woman nodded slowly, understanding. She took Lila's hand, and together they left the park, but not before Lila turned one last time, smiling brightly through her tears. Clint raised a hand in a small wave. When they disappeared into the distance, he let out a long breath, glancing up at the sky again. "Thank you," he whispered quietly. "Guess I needed that too." Later that evening, Clint sat alone on a park bench near the lake, the golden sunset painting the water with shades of amber and pink. He had removed his hat and rested it beside him, the little girl's note now open on his knee. "Be still and know that I am God." He read it again, letting the words sink deeper this time. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. A soft breeze swept across the surface of the lake, carrying the distant sound of laughter, birds, and the world continuing as usual. Yet Clint felt a peace he hadn't known in years. He thought back to his younger days, the noise, the fame, the struggle to prove something. All his life he had played strong men, gunslingers, warriors, leaders. But here, in the quiet of an ordinary day, he realized something profound. The greatest strength he had ever seen came from a child with a question about God. He smiled gently at the thought. Just then, his phone buzzed. He picked it up. It was a message from his assistant. "Sir, that video from the park is going viral. Millions of views already. People are calling it the faith moment." Clint chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Figures," he murmured. "You share one honest moment, and the world finally listens." He leaned back on the bench, watching the reflection of the sunset dance on the lake. For a long time he said nothing. Then, almost instinctively, he whispered, "If this helps someone find their faith again, then maybe that's why I was there today." His voice was soft, but it carried conviction, the kind that comes from a lifetime of learning that meaning doesn't come from awards or headlines. It comes from moments like this. Meanwhile, across the internet, the world was reacting. The clip of Clint kneeling beside the little girl had already reached millions. Comment sections filled with emotion. "This brought me to tears. I haven't prayed in years, but I just did." Faith isn't gone. It's just been waiting for a reminder like this. Churches played the clip during Sunday services. Parents shared it with their children. Teachers used it to talk about kindness and belief. And in a quiet corner of her bedroom, little Lila watched the video again with her mom, smiling as she whispered, "He said God listens." Her mother hugged her tightly. "He does, baby. He really does." Back at the lake, Clint stood up slowly, tucking the note carefully back into his jacket. The world might remember him for his movies, but he knew this small moment of truth would outlive them all. As he began to walk away, the last rays of sunlight caught his face. He paused, looking toward the horizon, and whispered one last line, almost like a prayer. "Sometimes, the smallest voices remind us of the biggest truths," he smiled, tipped his hat to the setting sun, and walked off quietly. Not as an actor or a legend, but as a man who'd just had a conversation with God through the heart of a child. By the next morning, the world had already changed. The video of Clint Eastwood and the little girl had spread across every platform imaginable. Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and news headlines around the world. It was trending under one title, The Day Clint Eastwood Talked About God. Clips showed the moment he knelt beside her, his voice steady and kind. They showed the tears in her eyes when he said, "Tears are just the soul's way of saying thank you." The comments poured in by the millions, people of all backgrounds, religions and beliefs coming together over a simple moment of truth. I showed this to my daughter. We both cried. I don't even believe in God. But this made me feel something pure. The world needs more conversations like this. It wasn't just a viral clip. It was a movement. People started sharing their own stories of faith, forgiveness, and rediscovery. Churches quoted his words. Schools discussed the moment in assemblies. Even those who didn't know much about Clint Eastwood began calling it the most human thing he ever did. But Clint himself stayed silent. He didn't make any public statements, didn't do interviews. For him, the moment was never about attention. It was about truth. A week later, Clint was back at his ranch, sitting on his porch overlooking the California hills. The evening light painted everything gold. The same notebook paper, the little girl's verse, rested on the table beside him. It had been folded and unfolded so many times. The edges were soft now. He leaned back in his chair, the sound of crickets filling the air, and smiled faintly. He wasn't thinking about the fame, the millions of views, or the headlines. He was thinking about her, the small voice that had asked a question big enough to move the world. He whispered softly, almost as if continuing a conversation that had never really ended. "You did good, kid. You reminded us all to listen again." Just then, his phone buzzed. A message appeared, a photo from Lila's mother. It showed Lila smiling, holding a handwritten sign that said, "I talked to God today." He listened. Clint smiled, his eyes misting over. He placed the phone down and looked toward the horizon. "I told you," he murmured with a grin. He always listens. That night, before turning in, Clint recorded a short video, his only public response. It was simple, raw, and heartfelt. He sat by his fireplace, hat in hand, and said quietly, "I've been asked a lot why I said what I did that day. Truth is, I didn't plan it. I just spoke from the heart. Maybe that's what faith is. Not something rehearsed, not something you prove, but something you live." He looked straight into the camera, eyes filled with calm certainty. "If there's one thing that little girl reminded me," he continued, "it's that we all still have questions, and that's okay. God's not afraid of your doubts. He's just waiting for you to talk to him again." He paused for a long moment. Then he smiled and said softly, "If you're watching this right now, take a minute, just one, and be still. Listen. You might be surprised who answers." The clip ended there. Within hours, that video joined the first one. Millions more views, millions more hearts touched. But to Clint, it didn't matter how many people watched. What mattered was that one message, one spark of hope, had found its way back into a world that desperately needed it. As the screen faded to black, his voice echoed softly in the background, his final words to the audience. If you believe that no question is too small for God, type faith in the comments, and remember, sometimes, it takes a child to remind us that heaven still listens.